And one time we were just knocking doors, and down this really, really weird little squirrely alleyway where there were doors tucked in every nook and cranny of people who just kind of built an apartment into what was ruins of an old building. And and we went down this one, and it went kind of under this building, and then we went up, and then in a squirrely corner over here, and just all over the place. And we came to this door. It was a metal door about probably 4 feet wide, with a little smaller square door set into it, like a little, in all the movies they do. It was like that. We didn't think about it at the time. It just looked like industrial scrap that someone had picked up and slapped on the front of something. And so we knocked on it. And this girl swings the door open. She's really well dressed. And inside, the floor is paved with marble, which we didn't expect in this part of town. It's got a couple of columns. There's a little fountain in the back. And we kind of, whoa. Well, I guess somebody else thought this building was pretty cool too, and they just put a lot more money into it than I would have expected. And she's like, well, who are you? And from the back, we heard an older voice say, Kie! Which is always the way they ask who's there at the door. You knock on a door, it's always, Kie! So, Kie! And she said, oh, it's just the Jehovah's Witnesses. And we said, oh, we're not Jehovah's Witnesses. And she said, oh, I'm sorry, it's just the Boy Scouts. And we're like, we're not Boy Scouts. Oh, I'm sorry, it's the evangelists. We're not evangelists. And she goes, all right, who the heck are you? And, well, she didn't say the word heck, but it's like, all right, fine, who are you? And by this time, the person who was asking was so curious, she came over and she said, come on in. And we sat down and we talked to her. And it didn't occur to us at the moment how odd this whole situation was. But then she had a really amazingly nice house. I mean, these little, she had an authentic ancient Roman statue just in her living room. And we went and went home after that, had lunch, and then went out. Lunch is the big meal of the day. You don't go home and eat dinner. You go home and you have a 2-hour lunch, because if you bother people during lunch, they're ticked. So you have a 2-hour lunch. Your morning studies are usually cut short. This was the tradition while I was there. Maybe they're having you bother people during lunch now, but all the missions were doing this when I was there. And then you go out and you proselyte later in the evening, because they only have a snack for dinner, no big meal to prepare. And we went to our next contact, which was on the other side of the city. And she's like, and people would ask this frequently, well, what part of the city are you working in now? Because everybody knows everybody there. And so they're like, oh, did you meet so-and-so? I know him. Nobody moves. If they do, they move a few streets. This one actually moved like a whole mile to the other side of Castellammare. And so we went and we talked to her, and she's like, where are you working? We're like, oh, we're working down in Scansano. And she's like, I grew up down in Scansano. We're like, really? And she's like, yeah, it's a zona particolare. And we're like, we know. And then she says, but what street are you on? And we're like, well, this morning we did Via California. And she said, oh, that's where I grew up. That was the very street I grew up on. We're like, no way. She's like, yeah, anybody let you in? We're like, yeah, this one lady. What was her name? Julia Mosca. And she's like, oh. And I'm like, oh, do you know her? And she's like, yeah. I'm like, oh, are you like friends? And she's like, I wouldn't say that, but I know who she is. And we're like, well, what do you mean? And so she pulls out the Mafia page, and she points to a guy who got arrested recently. And she's like, that's her husband. And the next time we went, she admitted to it. Her husband was in prison for Mafia dealings. Her son was in prison for Mafia dealings, and her son-in-law.